My name is Jen Krieger, and I'm an Agile coach at Red Hat. I work in the engineering platform department on the Project Atomic project. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to projectatomic.io, or you can follow my Twitter account, which is up there at MRRY550. So in the early days of my career, I was working as a financial analyst at a very small finance company in Miami Beach. So as you can see here, this is essentially what my view was every day. And that red arrow is where I worked. It's about give or take maybe a couple of buildings there. And if I leaned my head just so out the side of my cubicle wall, I could catch maybe this much view of the beach. And so it was very distracting. So what I did every day was I downloaded what amounted to anywhere between 50 to 60 spreadsheets, could be PDF files too, from a variety of banks. And my job was to take that information and type it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then also type it into a proprietary software system that we were developing, so that I could then compare that information from a third-party data stream that we were getting and do a couple of things. We were supposed to make sure that all of the income that we were supposed to be getting as an investment firm was actually coming in the way that it should have been. And then also the most important thing to a bank, I was supposed to verify that the fees that we were getting were calculated correctly. So I spent a lot of time looking at these numbers and typing them in multiple different places, and then also trying to compare from one system to another. And I was sitting there thinking one day, I said, gosh, this is a really error-prone process. I think it was like 22 at the time. And I said, there's just possibly not the end state for this, right? I knew that the data was coming in, and I should be able to query the data in some way. So I thought, well, if I just got access to query the production database, I could bring that information into my Excel spreadsheet and do all the comparisons with formulas or VBA or however I wanted to approach it. And I thought, I did a calculation, and I thought maybe I could save myself about 50 hours a month if I were able to do this. And there was also a team of 12 other people on my team who could probably also save a significant amount of time. And I thought I was awesome. I thought I was really awesome. So I proposed this idea to my management, and they also thought I was awesome. And so it kind of kicked off this whole conversation with our IT department. And unbeknownst to me at the time, it actually caused a little bit of a stir, because the IT department, I guess at the time, they really weren't interested in having a 22-year-old tell them, hey, this is a cool idea. So what I can only assume was a pretty heated conversation between my management and the IT department. I got the answer of whether or not I was going to be able to do this. And as you can probably imagine, it was no. So even though I didn't like the final answer, the IT department agreed to actually work with me and see if we could maybe create something in the application that would allow me to do what I was proposing to do without actually querying databases and all that kind of stuff. And so two neat things came out of that situation. So we spent a really long time actually talking about this, having meetings, trying to design everything. And as a result of all the information that I was sharing with them, I got my first job in IT as a project manager / business analyst. And I was super excited because it was where I wanted to take my career, and I wanted to learn more about automation, and I figured this would be a good place to do it. And the second thing that I thought was really important is that I got the business reason why I couldn't do what I wanted to do. And when I switched over to IT, I got the real reason why I couldn't do what I wanted to do. The real reason why. Not the fake one that's behind that wall of smoke and mirrors that we tell our CEO because we don't want him to know the real risk of what's going on. So let me break that down for you. We had a handful of servers. This is about 15 years ago, just for context purposes. We had a handful of servers serving this application to anywhere between 250 to 300 people. So like I said, it was a small company. And I don't really think at that point we knew really anything about load balancing or disaster recovery or anything like that. We even had the servers, all of our data, in the same building that we worked in. And as you'll remember, we were in Miami on the beach, the place that got hurricanes. Okay? This is for context. So when I was talking to the IT guys about this, they were saying, well, if we had given you access to production to query the data, you could have written something slightly wrong and brought our entire system down. And all those users who needed the application every day to do their jobs, to make decisions about our investment, and do what they were doing to make the company the $2+ billion a year that they made, would have not been available, and we'd have lost a significant amount of productivity. And if you're in IT, or if you are familiar with that, if a system goes down that the entire company is dependent on, it puts a little bit of focus on that group, maybe not so great focus. So they didn't really want to talk about that too much. So we talked about that design. We talked about bringing that information into the system. And after we designed it all out, we got an initial estimate from our engineers. And they said it was going to take about 9 months to code and build the UI for what I was doing in Excel. And it went all the way up the executive chain, because 9 months is an awful long time period. And as you all know, 9 months really means 1.5 years. So they just said, look, this is just not a good investment of our time. We have like 5 engineers. We need to be working on other things. This is really, even though it's going to save us a lot of time over here, we want to focus on these other things over here that are more important. So we didn't wind up actually doing it. So we pinballed off a bunch of different projects in a waterfall fashion. And then one day, the director of my department came in, and she goes, I was at this really awesome thing last night, and there was a bunch of executives around, and she was so excited. Like, she was bouncing off the walls, and she said, I heard about this new thing, and it's going to solve all of our problems. And we're going to be able to deliver software so much quicker if we just do this thing. And she said, oh my God, Agile software development. And so we went to training, and we learned everything we wanted to know about Scrum. It was a 5-day intensive Scrum training. And I mean, everything we learned about Scrum. But we learned 0 about how to communicate to one another. And it kicked off what I can only describe as the most hellish 2 years of my career. I literally only remember going to meetings during that period of time and trying to shout over the engineers who were constantly yelling at each other to get them to just kind of shut up and talk to one another in a civil fashion. And legitimately, it was so terrible after a certain point. There was an argument between one of the engineers and another engineer, and it went so poorly that one of the engineers actually got fired over it. So as you can see, we were terrible at communicating one another. And so looking back at that situation, I realized that the reason why we failed was for 2 reasons. The first one was we basically only took away from that training the mechanics of Scrum. And we didn't really want to talk about anything else that was revolving around Agile. We just said, hey, there's this framework, and here's how you do it. And once we do it, we'll be Agile, and that will be great, and we'll solve all of our problems. And then the second thing is that each one of us went into that training and only heard what we wanted to hear about it. So the engineers heard, hey, the business analyst is really the person who's getting between us and the business. So every time they translate requirements, they're clearly translating them wrong. So if I get direct access to that business person, I'm going to know exactly what to code, design, and develop, and it will clear up all of our problems. And me as a project manager and business analyst thought, well, gosh, now that I have this framework and also the daily visibility into what the engineers are doing, I'm going to actually be able to tell what the hell they're doing all day long. And maybe I can figure out how to get them faster so that we can get things out the door faster. As you can see, that's probably not as successful as you thought. So here's an example of what I mean by that. When we went into our first slew of meetings with our business people in an Agile fashion, we basically pick people out of the audience and say, you over there, you're now going to be our product owner, and you're going to be responsible for designing everything for us and answering all of our questions. And we had some business people who were like, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. That's great. Let's do it. And so the guy that we had on one of the teams, his name was Joe, and he's a really fantastic guy, and he was very into the idea of doing things the way we were doing them. And this describes what was a standard meeting with Joe and my engineers. Joe would come in, and he would say something like, I want these 3 fields on this screen over here, and I just want a checkbox, and I want a numeric field so I can type in this data, and then I want a comment field so I can comment about that numeric field. And Joe would say, this is just really simple stuff, we just need to do it. But me hearing that in my brain, I would say, well, we're designing to an 800 by 600 monitor. Back then, we only had 12-inch monitors, if you can believe it. Do you remember all the way back then? And I knew that the first thing that was going to come up was the engineers were going to say, I can't fit those 3 fields on this screen. And then the second thing they were going to say was, do you really need a checkbox? Because we also have a drop-down box where you can select from a list, or we can do some logic to auto-check the box for you, or, and then slew of ideas. And then on the numeric field, I knew I was going to get well, we need a tooltip, so we're going to need to understand exactly what's going into that field. And once they heard what was going into the field, they would say, well, isn't that kind of like this field over here? And why do you need to duplicate the data? And then for the comment field, and I'm seeing nodding heads, you're going to get the how many characters does it need to be? Is there data in this field that we could extract into another field so we can run a report off of it? If it's a really long field, how's it going to look on reporting? And as I was sitting with the business guy, and I was watching him have to answer all these questions, he did something that I knew was a tell of his that the engineers did not know. He picked up his BlackBerry, and he started typing on it. And he got this little furrow in the center of his brow, and I knew that was where he was going to start to get set off, because he was pretending to type. And when he picked up that BlackBerry and he started typing, the engineers got mad because they were like, he's not paying attention to us, so now we have to talk louder. And so there's this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And no one was picking up off of each other's body language. And it kind of ended in the sense of, well, I just want these goddamn 3 fields. And how dare you tell me how to design my system? And that was essentially how most of our conversations went early on. So these gaps in communication caused significant friction when we were trying to do Agile in the beginning. And instead of viewing my role as potentially a facilitator, I actually thought it was a little scary, because I was thinking, well, if these engineers can do a business analyst role, then what am I going to do for a career? Because I'm just going to have to leave. I could have actually coached them and shared those little tips. Like I could have said, hey, if Joe picks up his BlackBerry, maybe we should kind of end the meeting there, or come back later and have another conversation later. Or if you notice that little ticky mark in the center of his forehead, maybe you should stop talking to him, right? Or just say, hey, let's recap what we were talking about. But I didn't really think of that. So I could have used it as an opportunity to teach them, soft skills. So here are the soft skills I think you need to know in order to effectively work as a quote-unquote DevOps engineer. So the first one is communication. So that's a pretty broad term, but what I mean there is that most people think of communication as the words that are coming out of my mouth, or the text on an email, or IRC, or instant messaging, or whatever text-based form of communication you use today. You also need to be aware of the nuances in communication and how people actually change the expression on their faces, whether they're crossing their arms, whether they're leaning back or leaning forward, all those types of things. So there's a heck of a lot of nuance in communication that is not verbal. The second thing you need to know how to do is to collaborate with others. There is history of IT is that folks were subject matter experts, and they knew everything about one topic, and they naturally became a bottleneck, because every time you needed to get something done, you had to go to that person to get that thing done. And so instead now we actually have to focus on the idea that you have to work with others. You're actually trying to share your knowledge so that you're not a bottleneck, and you need to be able to work together with other people who have a little bit of knowledge here and there to address problems that might be larger than you as an individual can handle. And it's really not acceptable anymore to say, well, that thing that I'm noticing that's a really big problem is not part of my department or is not my job, and so I'm just going to, let somebody else deal with it. The expectation is that you're actually going to look at that and say, well, this compared to this problem over here, this is the most important thing that we need to address. And even though it's really not my wheelhouse, I actually need to maybe do something about that, and I need to talk to others to see if I can influence people to address it with me. The third thing is that you need to be able to resolve conflict. And when you are looking at DevOps, as the team I was on in IT at Red Hat last year was doing, what I noticed was that we were changing a lot of things, or we were maybe even suggesting that we could potentially change a lot of things that was kind of scary to people. They didn't like the idea that maybe we're going to rip out the things that they thought were the way to do IT. And so they were very nervous about this idea, and they were very resistant to the idea that potentially they would have to learn new technology. And it caused maybe some not so great conversations, because they were like, you're not going to touch my stuff. This is the way I know how to do things, so don't even talk to me about it. And so you're going to need to be able to have conversations with people in a way that is graceful and supportive and understanding of the fact that somebody might be fearful of having to learn something new. And finally, you're going to have to compromise. And this is the one that is really hard for me, too. So I will say it once. You're going to have to learn that you can't be right every time. And that is the straight-up truth. So let's talk about these things in terms of actual examples, because that's how I learned, so I figure it'll be helpful for all of you. And these are situations that could happen to all of you sometime in your career, or potentially have happened already. So ever get that manager who comes up to you and says, we're on project A, and this project is the most important project that we have ever worked on, and we are really far behind. In order for us to actually finish this project by release date, we're going to need to work weekends for the next 4 months. I've had that too. And I have a few friends in the gaming industry, and they work at a variety of gaming companies. And I've talked to a bunch of them, and they all seem to report similar things, which is there might be a little bit of slacking off for maybe the majority of a game development period. And then shortly before the game is actually going to get released, they somehow go from like these 25-hour work weeks to suddenly 70 or 80-hour work weeks to get things done. And I'm always like, what the hell are you guys doing? I mean, is there something maybe you'd want to consider changing so that you're not showing up to work from like 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. at night and just working and working and working and working? It seems like that might be a bad idea. And even though I've challenged them on this concept, they generally tell me that, well, the team got together, and we've been a team for many years, and this is what we agreed to do. So we all come in, and we all do this. And the reward we get is for part of the time of the year, we can just sit around playing video games all day at work, right? So it's great. I guess if you're in the gaming industry, playing video games is part of your job, right? So I guess why I bring that up is because I challenge them to think that once you say yes to something like that, you will never be able to say no. So the hard part is going to be saying no. And so how do you communicate that without seeming to be kind of a jerk? So think about this. Your manager comes up to you and says that to you, and you know you don't want to work weekends, and you know that no one else is going to say no to that person, right? So how do you do that? So there's 2 ways you can do it. The first way is the unacceptable way, in my opinion, which is you just don't show up. You just, hey, weekend comes, and you're like, well, I'm going to sit home, and I'm going to, mow the lawn or do whatever I do on the weekends, and I'm just going to, if somebody says something to me, it's, it is what it is. What happens with that is that your coworkers have this perception of you. They might have 1 or 2 perceptions. The first one is, this guy is a rock star because he didn't show up, and he did what I wanted to do, so this guy is awesome. Or, contrary to that, the other side of the fence is, this guy didn't show up. Where the hell is he? He's not a team player. And I guarantee you, your manager is going to have that second thought, not a team player, right? So the acceptable way to communicate this, and the one that I have found worked for me in the past, was to say something along the lines of, I understand that in order for us to meet the deadline for this very important project, that we'll have to work weekends. And I understand the reason why we're doing this is because XYZ reason, and we failed to do this by this date, and all the reasons why, just go for it. However, I also want to have a good home-work balance, right? So is there something that we can work out, maybe an adjusted schedule? Maybe I can come in late or leave early some days so that I can still focus on my family, my friends, my hobbies, or whatever else makes you passionate. And what that does is it switches the conversation from a direct no to a, you are sharing information with that person, and you're forcing them to be more empathetic to your situation. You're forcing them to listen to what you're having to say. And you're forcing them to maybe help compromise with you on maybe something that you can do to make it so that it's just not slogging through the weekends for 4 months in a row. And I encourage you to do this face-to-face, although sometimes it's hard, especially if you're distributed or your boss lives in another city, as it is frequently at Red Hat. My boss lives in Boston, and I live down in Raleigh, so it's hard to have face-to-face conversations. I can do it over video conferencing, but sometimes you miss body language on video conferencing if there's a delay. And the reason why I suggest face-to-face is because the body language will tell you whether or not you can push harder. So if somebody leans back and crosses their arms, or gets that furrow in their brow, or they, God forbid, look away from you, or are not making eye contact with you, you'll know that that person's like, forget it. The answer is going to be no. But if maybe they lean forward or put their hand in their, or put their hand on their chin and are like nodding with you as you're talking, you may actually be able to get more out of that person than you thought you would be able to. And that's basically why I say face-to-face is probably better off when you have to have that hard conversation with somebody. So by show of hands, how many of you think I'm an extrovert? An extrovert, somebody who is okay with public speaking, somebody who's, yeah, Ryan, it's not fair for Ryan because he knows me. I am so far from an extrovert, it hurts me to be up on the stage. I'm okay right now, but when I first started, my hands were shaking. So if you missed that, this leads us to common engineering situation number 2, aka soft skill number 2. And damn it, how are we all going to work together if we want to be in our silo over here alone in our cubicle with our closed door and our walls? How are we going to collaborate together? So the software industry has already moved into the world of collaboration. That ship sailed. I can't bring it back for anybody. So we have to think about things in a way that will help us actually deal with that very collaborative, it's almost like I said in my abstract, collaborate or die type of mentality where software development is concerned. So how can we make this easier for introverts? These are the tips that help me very specifically. Meetings are very difficult for me, and as a Scrum Master and Agile coach, that is the lifeblood of what I do. I am in meetings all day long. I talk to people all day long. So what I try to do for my introverts, which I wish somebody would do for me, is to schedule the meetings in chunks. So I never, at least I try not to, put an hour between one meeting and another. Because to me, what that means is that person has an hour where they're sitting there going, I've got a meeting in an hour. And they don't have that chance to kind of disconnect from what it is that they're doing, or maybe even get into something that they actually want to do, like coding or hacking on a system somewhere, or doing all these things that take them longer to get into the zone than an hour would give them. The guys I work with at Red Hat prefer for their meetings to be in the morning. We prefer to get pretty much all of that stuff done before lunchtime, because what that means is they can go off to lunch, take a deep breath from the meetings, and then come back and be able to code for the rest of the afternoon, or code for what it is that they want to be working on. The other thing I like to do for them is I like to make sure that they have 2 days, at least 2 days a week, where they have 4 hours in the afternoon that is uninterrupted. And what that gives them is the idea that they don't have to interact with people if they don't want to. They don't have to have face-to-face meetings with people if they don't want to. They can just do what their job is and kind of disconnect from everything around them. And the last thing I like to do is have at least 1 or 2 days a week. And I know that's a lot, but start with 1 where there are no meetings at all. Now, I don't count a stand-up, which is about 15 minutes on most of my teams, as a meeting. That's more of a touch base for people to say, do you need anything from me today? Or is it okay if I go ahead and hack or put my head down and not pay attention to any pings? But I like to have that full 8-hour day where no one's really interrupting the stream of work. And what I have observed, especially on a lot of my Agile teams, any team really, is that those blocks of time allow those engineers, or allow pretty much anybody on the team, doesn't just have to be engineers, it could be documentation people, QA people, the chance to take a deep breath and recover from the anxiety or heartbreak that they go through to have to force themselves into those collaborative situations. It makes it much easier for them to walk down the hallway and to have that conversation with somebody, or to pick up a phone and call somebody and have a conversation. And what I also like to tell people is collaboration doesn't always have to be face-to-face. And that is where I'm maybe a little bit not a standard Agile coach. Most people say face-to-face communication is the only way to do Agile. I actually think there are many other forms of collaboration that people can use to actually communicate with one another. And I recommend to the introverts on my team, which, by the way, I would easily classify 75% of my engineering team right now as introverts. If they put their information in our software, Trello we use to track status of what they're working on, if they use IRC to communicate with people and they seem to be present and responding to questions, if they're constantly checking in their code to GitHub, these are all streams of information that show me that they're collaborating or working on things together. If they've got to do a code review, they don't have to pick up a phone and say, I looked at your code, it looks good to me. They can just say, looks good to me on GitHub, and that is a form of collaboration to me. And what I like to emphasize there with them is that if they're more communicative in these tools, there's more of a likelihood that other people will respond to that and see that they're actually interacting with one another. So it tends to take that spotlight away from them, maybe for verbal communication or having to talk to people on video conference. And so finally, the last thing I like to tell everybody is we need to slow down in conversation more. So I have an example from my team from last year. I was working with 4 engineers, and 3 of them are far more on the extroversion side of the scale than the 4th, who is more absolutely an introvert. And the 3 of them would get into a design or brainstorming session, and they would be immediately a mile away from my introvert, bouncing ideas off of each other and saying, oh, what do you think about this? And how about, have you tried this tool? And have you tried that tool? And I think we should go this way. And they would have all this conversation. They'd make all these decisions. And like 10 or 15 minutes into the conversation, my introvert would raise his hand and he would say, did you consider this? And he would ask a question that would basically blow up the last 15 minutes of all their design. Because what he was doing, and I know he was doing this because I do this, he was thinking about everything that came out of somebody's mouth. And he was processing in his head, and he was comparing that information to the mountain of technical data that he had read, and thinking about all the options that he had. And then he would take the time to make a decision, and then another full minute, maybe minute or two, to think about what he wanted to say in a way that would be the perfect way to communicate his idea. And so as you can imagine, that doesn't happen in 30 seconds. It would take him a really long time. So the way that I got around this, and I don't even think they really even knew, although Ryan can confirm because he was one of my engineers, I made them go to the whiteboard and whiteboard out what they were talking about. So if you are in a meeting and somebody goes to the whiteboard and whiteboards out, I guarantee you, most of the time, everybody will stop talking. And the only thing that somebody might say is, well, what is that line up there? Or maybe you should connect this box to this box. Or I don't understand what you wrote over here. But they're not throwing out ideas anymore. They're kind of, the conversation has slowed down and the decision making has slowed down. So that's a helpful tip. And if you're a distributed team, that doesn't work because there's a lot of whiteboard technology out there. But I don't think I've ever seen a team successfully use it. Although you can tell me if I'm wrong later on. I like to restate the problems. So I like to tell, OK, everybody stop. Let's recap what we've talked about to this point. And here's a little tip that I like to give everybody. And again, they probably didn't even realize I was doing it. I like to say things a little bit wrong. And this is the reason why I like to say things a little bit wrong, is because 9 times out of 10, if I say this technical thing does this because of this, and it's wrong, an engineer will always correct me. And that is the restatement, oh, no, you're wrong because of blah, 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 blah. It gives everybody in the room a chance to rehear that decision or rehear from the words of that engineer what all of the information kind of falls at, what's the final decision. And everybody gets a chance to kind of rehear that from square one. So this leads us into common engineering situation number 3. I'm not arguing. I am simply explaining why I am right. Also, it's soft skill number 3, the ability to resolve conflict. So I was sitting in a room about maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and I had 2 engineers in the room. And both of them have been friends for many, many years. Their kids played together outside of the office, and their wives were really good friends, and they had a really good relationship. And they were arguing over these two tools, and the tools don't matter, but if you want to think of something, just think Ansible versus Puppet. And they came to a conclusion. They thought, this is going to be the tool that we're using, and here's all the reasons why we're going to be using it. And they were like, yeah, thumbs up. I think we're good. We're good to go. And then engineer number 3 joined the game. And they started arguing again about the decision that had been made and all the reasons why it was wrong, and it was not good. And it quickly devolved into this you-know-nothing Jon Snow type of situation in which they were arguing, and it was not civil anymore. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, gosh, when you are arguing, why are you directing your argument to me? It became clear that they were trying to convince me. Apparently, I had the final say, and I was like, I don't really know the answer to this question. But they were trying to convince me that their ideas were right. And as you may know, engineers have this idea that if they provide more details, then maybe somebody will agree with them because they've got so much more detail. And so I was listening to what amounted to a 20-page technical report with all the details of how things were going to be installed and all this crazy stuff. And I was just sitting in my chair, and I was overwhelmed by all this information. And I didn't bring my laptop to the meeting, which was a tactical error. And my phone was shoved so deep in my pocket that I figured if I tried to wiggle to get it, to maybe do some multitasking, they would notice, and I would be embarrassed by that. So I finally kind of lost my temper a little bit because they were arguing and no one could come to an agreement. And so I stopped them. I just said, we're going to stop this conversation right now. And I rephrased what they were saying. I said, I hear this. I hear this. They both have equal pros and cons. They both have equal use cases. I need you, the 3 of you, to go off to some war room somewhere and just shout at each other until you're done shouting at each other, and then come back and give me tool A or tool B answer. And so I had this single shining moment of realization during that conversation about tool A versus tool B, and I realized that I really didn't care about the tool selection at all. And I know that I'm at a technical conference, and you're probably thinking maybe, well, gosh, technology is my life. Why wouldn't you care about the technology that I love? I say that because the most important part of that conversation was that they were directing the argument to me, and I didn't care. I didn't care what they selected. So know your audience when you're having those conversations. Know how much detail that person needs in order to make a decision or in order to participate in the conversation. I certainly did not need all the information that they gave me. I just said, we're at a juncture in this project. We need to make a technical design decision, and we need to move forward. And you don't have 6 weeks to do that. You have to make a decision. And we're going to accept risk either way, so just make a decision. So definitely consider your audience. So let me get a drink of water, sorry. So, by the way, after restating that opinion, I've made these statements in public before, and most people focus on the Puppet versus Ansible thing, and then they come up afterwards and they tell me all the reasons why Puppet's better than Ansible or vice versa. I have heard this argument more times than I care to listen to it, and so I actually took the time to develop an opinion of my own because I thought it was important. And so I thought I'd share my opinion with all of you, which is, I still don't care. So I'm going to provide you some tips on how you can sway my opinion on this topic. I think the most important part of this talk, and likely why you all came, is because you thought I had some sort of magic sauce to convince people how to actually win an argument or how to control all technical decisions going forward. So here is my magic sauce on how to win an argument. The first thing you need to do is stop. Don't say anything. Take a deep breath, count to 10. You know, that age-old thing that your parents probably told you when you were having a temper tantrum as a 2-year-old. And don't respond to what that person is saying. And if you find yourself still kind of worked up at the end of that 10 seconds, you need to take another deep breath and count to 10 again. The next step, you need to listen to what the other person is saying. Not like that. You actually really need to listen and you need to understand what it is that they're trying to say. So don't get what they have that opinion. Don't understand what it is that they're talking about. You're like, what the heck are you even thinking? You need to ask them questions, okay? And not questions like, what led you to that kind of conclusion? Maybe you should say it like, what led you to that kind of conclusion? You know, I read this thing over here and it seemed to suggest something different. I wondered if you had time to read it and maybe tell me what you think about it. And what that does for you is it builds off of this idea that hopefully when you ask that question, the person will try to share more information on why they thought the way they did. And one of two things will happen. The first thing could be that through careful questioning or through introducing new information to the other person, they may actually start to change or sway their decision and maybe incorporate some of your ideas into their opinion. Or even better, maybe your own opinion will start to sway because you'll actually listen to what the other person is saying, and maybe they have information that you were not aware of that will change what you think about that technology or the argument you might be having. And finally, leading into soft skill number 4, you need to compromise. You're not going to be able to change everyone's mind all the time. And so you need to learn to identify when you should basically walk away from an argument or walk away from a conversation. This is one of the hardest things that I have to deal with on a regular basis. I'm Irish and I'm also Italian. So I love arguments and I also love winning arguments. So I have to take a deep breath a lot and say, is this something that I want to spend time arguing about? Or is this something that I am going to say, I need to walk away and I will chat with you further? And essentially what I find most people do in technology is they continue to argue until they are essentially mortal enemies. And finally, the most important piece of wisdom that I can give you is you don't need to actually attend every argument that you've been invited to. I don't know if anybody's heard this quote before. I get invited to a lot of arguments as an Agile coach at Red Hat. A lot of arguments. Agile is a new thing for Red Hat. I'm working with the platform department. That's RHEL. In case you were not aware, RHEL releases on a 2 to 3 year cycle, right? And so it tends to be maybe more of a waterfall focused type of release process. So when I come in and I have all these fancy Agile ideas, people like to challenge me on them. You know, collaboration, communication, whatever. That's not a thing. Retro, I'm not going to talk to you about my feelings on something. So I have a lot of conversations with people in which I have to have, you know, it's not easy conversations. So I have to decide when I'm going to stick to my guns and say, no, we're going to do things this way, and you're going to have to become comfortable with that, or when to walk away because I know that arguing with somebody about something is just going to make them more willing to ignore me in the future. So it's a really hard skill to do, but once you can figure out that skill, then you pretty much will win every argument because you will not attend them. And you'll have your opinion, or maybe you'll talk to somebody about their opinion and change yours. And so here's a caution for everybody in the room regarding arguing. Open source tends to have a lot of text-based communication. So if you are somebody who is emailing or IRCing or tending to be combative in a text-based communication, shame on you. Everybody has an opportunity to step away from their computer and rethink what they're going to send to somebody. And what I like to tell people is if you're going to send an email to somebody that is going to hurt somebody's feelings, and gosh, we should all be human enough to know when you're writing something that you know is maybe a little bit salacious or maybe a little bit harmful, we all need to step away from our computers and say, okay, take a deep breath, go talk to somebody, or maybe even have somebody read what it is that you want to send and help you edit it down or make it a little less, you know, impactful to somebody else's feelings. It's much harder to have these types of arguments face-to-face. And so what I like to tell everybody is I will always personally give folks a pass if they get into a conversation with somebody in a public space or even in, you know, just together, and they get emotional about something or they get upset. Because to me, that is the worst form of communication. It is the hardest one to learn how to avoid, and it is the hardest one to improve at. So if you just take these tips that I have talked about and you try to work on that, you try to gain confidence in maybe having that hard conversation with your manager about not working weekends, or talking to a coworker that does not want to change a technology that you know is the right decision to make, the more you practice at those types of things, the better off you will get. And so here's your homework for everybody in the room. Practice expressing your opinions concisely and calmly. Pay attention to body language. Collaboration doesn't always have to be face-to-face. Use all the tools that you have access to. You don't have to be right every time, and you don't have to attend every argument that you're invited to. And so this is the point in the man pages where we show examples. And I'm a really big fan of learning by doing. And so instead of me asking, are there any questions, what I'd like to do is see if anybody's brave enough to share a situation that maybe they recently had where things didn't go so well, and we could talk about maybe what you could do differently in the future. And also, I've got really cool stickers, so if you want to share, I will let you pick. Go ahead. I'll come down.
Yeah, all right. So I work in a company in retail, e-commerce, and we have a bunch of people from different cultures: Pakistan, Indian, Irish, Polish, Danish. So a big mess of people, and there you meet these people who are very introvert, but also very stick to the point. And we have one particular who always tends to, he has been around the project forever. He knows pretty much every single line of code by hand. And that's amazing. It's an amazing gift he has, but his communication skills and the way he is behaving to people is very strict. And the more right he wants, or if people are not listening, as you say, the more he will be like banging in the table, or he will be very direct. And what I'm working with him as a Scrum Master, Agile coach with the teams, and it's exactly what you're saying, how stop him or get him to go to the whiteboard together with some of the others, or make him actually shut up sometimes is better than letting him continue, because you lose the room one by one, and the developer lose the respect for him. Even though he has the most brain of all of them, it slightly goes down, and you don't want that. So, yeah.
Sorry for the mic. I know this is probably not the best situation. Early in my career, I actually worked with an engineer who was a similar person. He was a lead engineer, and he definitely had an opinion about all the software that we developed, and he was very adamant that everything had to be done his way. And it was very difficult for me because I was much younger, and I was constantly having arguments with him because I thought, well, every time I needed a decision made, I have to go to this guy, and I can never get anything done because he's never available. Also, his team, a wide variety of skill sets, from junior engineer all the way up to senior principal engineer, if you would. And what I observed was that the senior engineers were starting to get a little irritated by the fact that they could never be responsible for any decisions or be responsible for anything that maybe was part of the reason why they were hired. And I don't think I could say that I was ever successful with him, but what I would probably do now, having had this situation far more often than when I was younger, is I like to take those people aside and have a conversation with them about the way that they're talking to just engineers in general. And I actually recently had a conversation with somebody at Red Hat about it, and I said to him, you are a mentor to the folks who are around you. They're looking up to you because you've been in this situation for so long, and they're taking their lead from you. And you may, in 20 years from now, be done with your career, but these guys, they have like 40 years left, and you're giving them this idea that this is the way that things are supposed to work, and you're not paying attention to the change. Like, I just say to me, technology changes all the time. What makes you think that the way that we talk to each other or the way that we're trying to do our process wouldn't change too? So I tried to get that across to him, tried to get him to agree to maybe change the way he talks about things a little bit. But it is hard because we also have a pretty large office in Brno, and there is a cultural divide there that is difficult to deal with. And we have offices in Germany, we have offices in India, we have offices in pretty much all over the world, to be honest with you. I've noticed that when I was in IT, our folks in our India offices were sometimes more interested in just taking direction than trying to come up with an idea on their own. So it's hard because you have to have a personal relationship with somebody to get across to them. And again, working in a distributed company, you don't get to meet that person face to face all the time, right? But again, I would recommend having a conversation with him and asking him if he maybe he doesn't understand the type of perception he has. Do you think he'd?
Well, we worked a lot with him, so it's going in the right direction, but it takes a little long.
Yes, it's not going to be. This is not an easy. Yeah, this is not easy. This is not just like an agile adoption in an organization or any sort of change management or any sort of process change. These things are not going to happen overnight. You're not going to become a quote-unquote DevOps engineer like just suddenly. You can learn all you want to know about technology, but if you can't have that, as we like to call in my previous team, the conversation in meat space that does not have people basically table flipping, you are going to not be maybe as successful as you want to be.
I would say getting them to admit that they have a problem with it themselves is
Yeah.
the first step.
Yeah, so getting them to admit that they have a problem is the first step. That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Do you would go ahead and select a sticker?
And follow up with that, we had a similar situation. We had an expert who was so disruptive because he wanted to try his way. I eventually challenged him. I said, here's the deal. We will put all the resources on trying your way, but if you are wrong, you need to be silent for 48 hours. And it actually worked. He was wrong, and then literally he'd start to say something, and they know this is true, that's why they're laughing. He'd start to say, Greg, you can't speak. You have another day and a half, you can't say a word. And then he realized, now I understand what the problem was. I'm insisting we try my way, it ended up not being right. It was disruptive to the overall process, and sometimes you have to be extreme, but it works, sometimes.
I can also confirm that I've done things that are extreme. I also have told people to shut up in meetings. Sometimes I lose my Agile coaching hat and put on the angry Irish Italian hat and say, what the bleep, bleep, bleep do you think you're doing? So yeah, every one of us is, but I like your idea actually. It's a very good one. Anybody else? No one else brave? Go ahead. Oh, I should not put this back on.
I just want to mention another type of people, those people who are unsure of themselves and their position in the workplace, and it comes out as aggression. Probably everyone has met that kind of people, that they don't necessarily have a lot of knowledge, but they want to give that kind of facade or the outlook that they have.
Anybody else have somebody like that in their workplace? I have not experienced that one. I have the person who is really shy and unsure of what they know, and they never speak up. And so I'm constantly trying to draw them out. I don't have somebody who responds. I've actually never had somebody who responds with aggression because I don't know. Oh, you have. A Scrum Master that responds with aggression.
A lot of pressure from upstairs, so to speak, kind of put a lot of pressure on him.
Yeah.
And then you can just see if you ask the wrong thing at the wrong time, it can even be a friendly reminder of something. Remember we have this meeting now. What happened?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that happening. I've observed. Actually, I take that back now. I have observed that. I have not observed it from an engineer, though. I've observed it from project managers, program managers. I have actually not experienced that at Red Hat so far, but I have experienced it at previous places where somebody felt threatened by what I knew or what somebody else knew, and they got very aggressive when.
In our case, the guy has his own expertise this area.
Mhm.
He really stands on it.
Okay.
Every time he has to talk about something, he talks about that thing, even if it's not really connected to the topic.
So,
So that's it. He's defending his own territory, very aggressive.
so defending his own territory and only wanting to talk about his subject matter expertise, what my brain does is say, probably that guy needs to go into more training or try to find a new technology, or is there a focus on extending career skills at your organization? Or has somebody maybe talked to him about what he wants his career goals to be? What's the next thing for him? All that kind of good stuff. You don't know, yeah. I have worked at organizations that don't have that type of focus. Red Hat certainly does, which is really great. We get to define what we want to do, and we get to go for it, however we want to do it. And I've not had a manager who hasn't been supportive of that. But at previous companies, certainly at that finance company, my goals were set for me by my manager, and I had no say in them at all. And training budget was non-existent, so whatever it was that they set for me was set in stone, and my career direction was based on what they thought it should be. And as an intellect and knowing what I wanted for my career wasn't aligned what they wanted, it was hard. It was hard. But it seems like what could be missing there is asking this gentleman what he wants from his career and maybe giving him an opportunity to expand his skill set.
Now that I think about it, I think it could be also he wants some validation.
He wants validation. Yeah. Maybe a little bit scared, too, that he might be supporting a technology that's dying or hasn't much interest. Okay, he doesn't want. See, and then that could be resolved by helping him get other skills or filling in a skill gap, right? So this is. I often have a conversation with folks and they say, "What does an Agile coach do?" It's up for me as a Scrum Master or an Agile coach to kind of identify that stuff and say, "Hey, you seem to be maybe needing something more here." And so this is the whole soft skills part of software engineering that fails to really be addressed a lot. I find that oftentimes what we do is we lump Scrum Master roles in with technical lead roles or other roles and say, well, it's really just about making sure things get done when they should be getting done. But in reality, it's also to identify maybe what a manager might not pick up on because they're not spending as much time as you are with somebody. So, yeah, it's tough. It's tough. Anybody else? I think we're out of time, too, because the door just opened. Am I?
No. Every time we come up with something old, he tries to give it analogy to explain himself and tries to push it on.
So everything that he says is all about him, right? Yeah, that's difficult.
Those kind of people are very difficult.
Yeah, it can be quite difficult. And honestly, I found that when there's a person like that, $10 says he's the same person that this gentleman over here has, except he's probably not being aggressive about it. So it's a uncertainty in skill set, uncertainty in what I know, and trying to make themselves appear more inflated about what they know than maybe they do. Somebody accused me of being, quote unquote, a DevOps guru, and I said, I don't know everything about every topic, and I certainly don't know everything about DevOps. I'm just here to share what I learned, and I'm always interested in hearing what other people have to say, and I think that is another important thing to share with people and get them to understand. I think there's a certain level of egotism that you have to have in order to realize that, and maybe some people just don't, they can't expose themselves. They don't trust very easily to be able to say they're not an expert in something or they don't know as much as everybody else does. That's something I observe quite often in engineering, actually. So, all right, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it.